But anyway, this year I decided to look at how people got to the West Coast from Chicago via train, obviously, because we're the Railway Historical Society, but also look at air versus bus and the car. So now we're going to look at air travel because when I got into this, I was very interested that the early airlines copied the railroads. They actually followed the railroad tracks for navigation because they didn't have radio beacons or anything. So the airplanes took off and then they flew along and they're following the railroad tracks. They also used the railroad operations as their model because they didn't know what, but they said, well, we got to have something. So and the timetables, if you look at the timetables from the 50s, they're virtually identical to the railroads. The fare structures were similar, and they even had sleeper planes back then. So I mean, they were modeling the railroads exactly. The other thing I found interesting is that the TWA used the Santa Fe and the Pennsylvania as its model. United used the Union Pacific, American Airlines used the Southern Pacific, and Northwest used the Northern Pacific. So TWA back then was the Transcontinental and Western Air. And they actually, you probably read about this, but they actually ran a train plane service. So you could get from New York to LA in 48 hours versus like 120 hours if you took the train straight through. So you'd get on a Pennsylvania train in New York City at the Penn Station, and you go overnight to Columbus, Ohio. And then you get off the train, you go on a bus, you go out to the airport, and you had to fly in a Ford Tri-Motor to Wayanoka, Oklahoma. And so there were 4 stops. And the Tri-Motors were all metal. They had 3 engines. They were pretty reliable, but they were pretty slow too. And you're also flying along at relatively low altitude, so it was probably pretty rough. So anyway, now you're in Wayanoka, Oklahoma. You get on the Santa Fe, and you take the train overnight to Clovis, New Mexico. There you get out on a bus and you go out to the airport, and you get on a Tri-Motor and you fly to Los Angeles. So it was total of 120 hours versus 48 hours versus 120 hours. So they were doing that. And then Transcontinental Air and Western Air Express merged to form TWA. Well, then, of course, later on, TWA became Trans World Airlines after World War II when they started flying all the way to Europe and the Far East. TWA was run by Howard Hughes, who also designed the Constellation. And it was quite an advanced plane. It was pressurized right after the war. And he took one of these and he flew it nonstop from Los Angeles to Washington. And he set a record for piston planes. But here's TWA. Now you look at and it goes Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh to Chicago. That's the Pennsylvania main line, right? And then it goes Kansas City down to Wichita, Amarillo, Albuquerque, Winslow, Los Angeles, and then up to San Francisco. And then you look at the Santa Fe, and you go, gee, that's Chicago to Kansas City, down to Amarillo, Albuquerque, across to Los Angeles, up to San Francisco. So they literally used the Santa Fe as a model. Now we saw this. This is the Union Pacific route for their passenger trains, and United Airlines was formed in the West Coast. And if you look at the western part of United Airlines, they went to Des Moines, Omaha, Cheyenne, Salt Lake City, down to Los Angeles, up to Pendleton and Portland, and then of course to San Francisco. So it's exactly the same as the UP. And then American followed the SP. They came west from Texas, across to El Paso, to Phoenix, to Los Angeles, and then on up. So now Northwest, of course, came up to they went to Milwaukee and then St. Paul, Minneapolis, and then on west. And guess what? They're following the Northern Pacific exactly. And it makes sense because the NP was built first. And so that's, as I said before, That's where all the cities are. But it was just interesting that they followed it exactly. And so there's the NP, and there's how you would fly from to Seattle in 1935. And so if you got you would either be on one of these Electra L10s, the first Electra, not the second one. This is at St. Paul Airport. You got kind of climbed on the plane and you took off. And my dad actually, when he finished school, he started working for Northwest in 1935. And so and then in 38 he went and joined the Army because of the war. But he said, yeah, when you go west, you would stop everywhere. It was a lot of stops. And so if we look at trips in 35, you made all these stops. And then in 48, after the war, they had the DC-4, this thing, and now they could fly a lot further. And then, of course, in 58, they had the DC-7C, which and DC-6B, which could fly nonstop from Chicago to Seattle. Yeah, we're talking a little bit before we started about the DC-6. I think some of you guys might have flown. That was very reliable. This thing, they basically took it's a 3,350 cubic inch engine, and they were getting 3,500 horsepower out of it. It was very elaborate. They had double super turbochargers, and then they actually put a turbocharger in back using the exhaust of the engine, and they picked up a few hundred more horsepower. So they were very elaborate, and unfortunately they were only available about 60% of the time, so they didn't last too long. And then the jets came in, and that was it. So if we compare all the airlines, how they went, Northwest going from Chicago to Seattle, if you left in 1935, you'd leave Chicago at 7 in the morning, and you'd arrive at 8 p.m. Pacific time. So it's 2,100 miles, 15 and a half hours. That's like flying to Australia, you know. Average speed 135 miles an hour, 15 stops. 1948, it was DC-4, and you'd leave in the around noon, and you got in about the same time. But that was only 11 hours, so that wasn't too bad. And then, of course, the DC-7 came in when it was available, and you could make it in 5.5 hours. And then today, it's about 4.5 hours, because now, of course, you have about half an hour to an hour on each end waiting to get on the runway. So, and here's the Boeing 720. Those came in the early 60s, and that pretty much took care of a lot of train travel. And then today, of course, is the Delta 757 you fly from Chicago to Seattle. Okay, so we'll look at the highways. Now, again, just like the airlines, the highways followed the railroads. Of course, they went through the cities and everything, but it was just amazing how US 10 literally followed the NP. And if you've driven US 30, that follows the Northwestern, and then it follows the UP all the way across. And then US 40 follows the Southern Pacific. US 90 follows the UP, and 66 pretty much followed the Santa Fe. So of course Greyhound comes in, and here's a bus from the 50s. They're going to follow exactly the same routes. So say we'll pick 1963, which is still right before they really hadn't built many freeways by then. So you still had to go through all the towns and everything. And you'd leave Chicago in the evening, you'd come up to Minneapolis, and then you just head west on Highway 10. 2,063 miles. It took 60 hours, which is about the same as the Mainstreeter. And so 52 stops. San Francisco, you'd leave at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, go to Salt Lake City, and that was 61 hours. And Los Angeles, you basically went down via Tulsa, and that was 54 hours. That was a little bit faster because Highway 66 was pretty good. Fares. In 1948, coach on the airplane cost $120, which in today's dollars would be about $1,500. So it's it was pretty expensive back then. And air first class air was $220, which is $2,800 today. Train coach was $39. First class train was $74, 1948, and the bus was $30. So now if we're going to drive, we would drive Seattle to most people, unless you're going to, do one of these things where you alternate drivers and stuff like that. Most people would take about 5 days to drive from Chicago to Seattle because you remember there's no freeways, so you had to go through all the towns and slow down and stoplights and all that stuff. And San Francisco is about 5.5, and Los Angeles is about 6 days. So Chicago to Seattle, you take Highway 12 and then Highway 10, and you'd go to St. Paul. Most people, a typical trip would be St. Paul, and then you go to Bismarck, then you go to Billings, then you drive to Missoula, and then you go to Seattle. And so 5 days. And so if we do a comparison, on the Great Northern Empire build, it was 44 hours. If you fly Northwest, it was 11 hours. A Greyhound bus would be 60 hours. And if you drive a car, it's 105 hours and 40 hours of driving. So if we look at the conclusion is that the U.S. railroads were really critical for the expansion west. But passenger traffic peaked in 1920. Now, what happened in 1920? Well, that's when Ford built the Model T. Government started upgrading the highways, and people liked driving their cars. Americans loved their cars. Then in 1958, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, and there was an explosion of money to build interstate highways. And of course, as we know, trucks only pay about 20% of the cost of using the roads. So I think the railroads were being punished for their robber baron days, and so that's kind of hung with them. Now we look at the airplane. That is pretty remarkable. And if you read about flying, the French were flying around in the late 1800s in airplanes. So the problem was they couldn't control them. They'd fly and they had a lot of crashes and stuff like that. Fortunately, they were pretty low speed, but it was the Wright brothers that perfected the airplane controls. They did over 100 different things, and they would take sitting out there in Kitty Hawk, and they would change one thing and try it, and then they changed another thing and try it. And they were the first ones who had controlled flight. They took this old thing to Paris, and the Frenchmen were sort of looking at it at this big field south of Paris. They're looking at this thing. Well, they took off and they thought, oh, that's interesting. They got down to the end of the field, and Wilbur Wright made a 180-degree turn, and they were all shocked because they'd never seen an airplane do that. And he flew back, and then he did another turn, and then he did a figure eight, and they were just blown away because nobody else had figured out how do you control the airplane. It's a lot more complicated than they thought. So then if we think about during World War II, I believe technology with airplanes advanced about 100 years in 4 years. Because if you think about it, in the 1930, we're flying in the Ford Trimotor, flying at about 130 miles an hour, non-pressurized. You can only go, 150 miles. And 40 years later, there's the 747, where you can go 6,000 miles with 400 people. That's only 40 years. That's pretty remarkable. Now, of course, interestingly, we're pretty much still as we were in 1970. Things haven't changed very much. So here's a graph of rail passengers in millions. So and it did peak in 1920, and then the car came in, and that was really the one that knocked the number of passengers down. And then of course it went up during the war, and then and then there was a second peak, as I talked about, in 1958, because people did like the streamlined trains. But then of course the jets came in, and that kind of took care of. And then Amtrak. Interesting, there's been quite an uptick in the last 10 years with Amtrak. So, but look at freight traffic. I mean, it is just in the billions of ton miles. It's just gone off the charts. Any questions?
Yeah,
Ross, can you hear me?
I'll repeat the question, Joe.
What is a strata?
Took a trip as a kid in a strata cruiser. He wants to know what the strata cruiser was.
Strata Cruiser was a Boeing. Basically, it was the B-29 after the war that they put a passenger fuselage on, and Boeing wanted to have an airplane right away. And well, you're very lucky to have traveled on one of those. They were really good. It was basically the B-29, and it was very comfortable, pretty reliable, but it was expensive to fly because it was a big plane. And but Northwest had them, United had them, American Airlines had them, BOAC, a number of other airlines had them, and the passengers loved them. The crews loved them. They could fly a long distance, and they're pretty fast. But basically, it was a B-29 wings and tail that they expanded and put a double fuselage on it. And they initially they had a little lounge downstairs, and then of course later, like they often do, they put lounges on the plane, and then later they fill it with seats.